Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel today. I'm Carl Kim. I'm a professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Hawaii, where I also direct a national congressionally authorized center, the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center, which develops and delivers training courses for first responders and emergency managers throughout the nation. I'm really delighted to be here with an excellent panel today. I changed the title a bit to Stay or Leave, Mitigating and Adapting to Sea Level Rise and Coastal Hazards.
Again, thanks for having me here. Wanted to just share some information on how DOT is looking at resiliency and what the steps that we're taking. And this will be real short. Just want to make sure that we get this out there and get everybody to the question and answer period. For us, when we started looking at resilience, we started looking at it in 2003. Looked at our shorelines and our rockfall areas and put together plans to make sure that we had stepping processes and prioritizations on how to address all of these things. Those plans sat on the shelf until 2016. So we took a really good step in the beginning, but we never really followed through with it. And understandably so. When you look at climate change and resilience or impacts to our system based on more extreme events happening more often, that's the gorilla that we saw 50 years down the line. Something that's going to happen in the future. But every day we still got to deal with all the other issues with congestion, safety, and conditions of our roadway. So when we started looking at prioritizing our funding, that's where the funding went. We didn't really see that issue becoming a bigger issue in the short term, right? In 2016, we started repicking everything up to make sure that we can push forward on resilient systems for our communities. And so one of the biggest things that we saw when looking at our resilience plan, it takes an absolute commitment from leadership. If we don't keep that gorilla right in front of everybody to tell everybody, if we don't take these steps now, these are the eventualities that are going to occur. These are the costs that'll keep running up. These are the impacts that you're going to have on your system every day. If we don't keep that conversation going, we can get sidetracked again with the day-to-day issues that we always deal with. So of course, to understand that, we got to make sure we have our vulnerability studies in place, get our assessments done, and create a plan. So we did that for DOT. We looked at in that plan the short, the mid, and the long-term solutions. We didn't want to just focus on the big things in the future. We want to make sure that we defer towards action. Take small steps in each way that we can to set ourselves up for the big actions. And to do that, we made sure that we pilot everything. We don't like the word study. It's a four-letter word for DOT. We want to make sure that when we move towards looking at how it's going to work. If it works, awesome. Let's move and keep doing it. If it doesn't work, adjust so we can keep going, but always get that action going. Then with all of those, we're looking at the big long-term solutions of how we can realign, how we can build back our systems after they're impacted to be more resilient day after day. That's our approach. We built this approach, like I said, we had our report, our shoreline protection report that we put together in 2003. Because we didn't do anything with it, everything was stale in it. So we updated it to our statewide coastal highway program report that we worked with to develop. In that report, we prioritized everything to ensure that we had those short-term steps, things we had to do within a year to protect the system. The midterm steps, how we can build more time in the system to ensure that we can look at the long terms. And we also put together our climate adaptation action plan. This is big for us to make sure that we had steps that we got to follow to get to a more resilient system quicker. The great thing is legislature put together an act that was passed that put Office of Planning in charge of all of this, which is awesome. now it's their job to coordinate us to ensure that we're working in the right direction. But we want to make sure that we pushed everything forward so we can assist them and give them information that we have. So hopefully we can tie everybody together. So I'm just going to go through a couple of things that we normally do in DOT to start addressing these hazards that we know that are occurring now and that we know that are coming. Emergency repairs. Everybody's seen it, right? I mean, if you've read any news in the last 2 years, you'll know that Coimbra Highway along the North Shore is getting impacted daily by ocean wash and by erosion. In the past, all we would do is think, I got to protect my road. So I'm just going to build myself a retaining wall, stop my road from getting eroded, and who cares what happens to the beach? Fully understanding that anytime there's something hardened in an area, it causes more erosion outside of the hardened areas. So we stopped that. But in the interim, in places like Haula and Kava, we had to do something immediate. So we worked with DLNR, with Department of Health, and with the Corps to come up with some soft revetments, some areas that we could put in either cobble and boulder fill or bags, like Kiowa bags, to ensure that we can protect our roadway from being eroded and minimize any impacts it would have outside. But there's still impacts, and this still requires maintenance. So there's a lot of people who say, hey, you did some work out there, but it's just a Band-Aid solution. They're right. We did this to make sure that we could do it really quick to protect the road as quick as possible so we can start developing the next solutions in that area. One of the solutions that we're considering, or the change of mindset that we have in the past, like I said, my road is my responsibility. Everything else, that's the DLNR. But now we're trying to see how we can use our resources to protect our road in better ways. We're trying to see if there's a way we can passively reestablish beaches along those areas. So we did some research. We found this sand saver solution that allows us to put in a passive system that could potentially allow us to replenish the beach. And if this works, that replenishment will not only protect our roadways from further erosion, but it also re-deliver something that was lost to the public a while ago. I know you guys all grew up, anybody who grew up in Oahu, you all know that those beaches used to extend 50 to 200 feet out from the roadway. Now it's 20 feet, 30 feet at the most. So if we can redevelop those resources for the community while we protect our roadway in a better way, I think it's a win-win for everybody. So again, this is something that we're not studying, we're just putting it out there, we're piloting it now to ensure that we can see if it works, see if there's enough sand out there to replenish the beaches, see if the system actually works. If it doesn't, we'll find another solution. When we started looking at our system, we had a typical way of designing things. Any bridge we replace, we'll replace it with a 75 to 100-year structure. It's concrete, it's going to be reinforced concrete because that's what we do. But we fully understand that there's routes that we have on our system that have to operate today that will not be there in 50 to 100 years. So we're changing the way we design our systems to ensure that we take into account first whether or not our standards are substandard. So we used to design for the 100-year flood everywhere. We know that there's flooding occurring even in those 100-year areas. So we're looking to see if a 250 or 500-year design storm is more appropriate for some of those portions. We're also looking at these routes where we know they're not going to be located in these areas because they're going to be inundated by sea level rise, and putting in 30 to 40-year structures, steel structures that we can just drop in place and move when we need them. So we're adjusting the way we do business to ensure that we consider the impacts of the future. We're looking at areas that we can potentially relocate now. The biggest cost in relocation is land. In areas where we know we have that land, we'll try and see how we can adjust to ensure that we can either give us more time or pull us out of the inundation zone totally. In Laniakea, we have options to relocate our long-term project, but 60 million bucks, and there's still a bunch of historic properties that we're gonna have to deal with. We know it's gonna be at least another 10 years before that happens. So in the interim, we're gonna do an $8 million small realignment that gets this portion out of the inundation zone for the next 25 years. That gives us a little more time, that takes care of some of the congestion issues on the system now, and takes care of a lot of the safety issues that are occurring with pedestrians and vehicles. So again, it's not the long-term solution that we're going to get to, but it's something that gives us more time. This is just a little example of that smaller realignment that we're considering there. In areas where we know we got to take care of immediately, Honolulu Highway is a big example. 33% of the economy on Maui lives west of this area here that gets inundated, impacted daily by sea level wash, ocean wash. We know this is going to be inundated. So we're looking at relocating this portion. There's a 5-mile stretch in this area that we're going to move. And when we move it, it's going to cost us about $90 million. So on the right side, you'll see our previous plan for Honolulu Highway realignment. You can see that it goes further north. So these are the phases that haven't been built yet, C and D. those were the next steps. Those were the considerations. We've scrapped those for now because we know the need is going further south. So we're starting up at the end of the Lahaina bypass, where it ended on the southern side. And we're building this stretch next, this 5-mile stretch that gets us out of this area, takes us out of the inundation zone, gets us out of our impacts. And again, takes care of congestion, takes care of safety issues at the same time.
Drag it out too much, but basically the typical insurance contract involves a relatively modest premium collected by an insurance company on a regular basis, usually annually, with the guarantee that it would pay out a predetermined sum of money in the event of damages caused by a named peril. That's an insured event. And as you know, it's basically a tool for spreading risk and among a larger group of people so that one person or one entity doesn't bear the entire cost of the bad luck of getting damage from a hurricane or any of the other insured events. In order for the insurance market to work, insurers need a good sense of the frequency of the particular types of events, how severe they might be, and the factors that contribute to risk, also that they can do the actuarial analysis to set appropriate premium rates, and that's the insurable risk. And in a well-functioning insurance market, policyholders and their communities are aware of the key factors that contribute to their risk and can take those protective actions to lower that risk, oftentimes with rate discount incentives. They'll get lower premiums if they take those steps. That's if the insurance market is working appropriately. So at a high level, insurance serves a dual role to compensate for the loss, but also to drive modifications in behavior to minimize that loss in the future. Historically, what I'm going to talk about, it basically covers private property, not the public property that Ed just went over. And then I could talk about the reinsurance market on a more global scale. Most insurers sell off part of their risk to global insurers like Swiss Re or Munich Re, who then provide insurance for the insurers. But on to the next slide. So traditionally, the problem has been many coastal property insurance markets are considered too high risk for private insurers, and the US response has been the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. Even if a private insurer offers a policy or coverage, it's often fashioned off what happens at NFIP. So climate change and sea level rise have really presented unprecedented challenges to the insurance industry, which they're trying to address. But even without that, the NFIP program was in trouble. So go on to the next slide. Thanks. So $5 trillion is what the insurance industry is globally, and climate change is really shaking things up. Doesn't mean they're not doing anything or we're not doing anything about it. The next slide shows a United Nations report that was just issued earlier this year, laying out a framework on how insurance in the global scale, primarily reinsurance, but also the direct insurers, how they can enhance their ability to assess the climate change futures so that they can actuarially and more accurately set the risk of loss so that they can then set the appropriate premiums. Next slide. So sea level rise, NFIP was created in 1968. It's been amended several times. The problem, one of the first problems is that it provides subsidized premium rates. And depending on the zone that you're in, those premium rates are 1/3 to 1/2 of the true risk cost. And even before, as I said, even before there were new impacts of climate change and sea level rise, NFIP was in trouble. It currently owes the US Treasury over $20 billion, which is one of the largest financial obligations of the US government. And historically, the FEMA maps that NFIP uses do not reflect the projections, have not historically projected the projections of sea level rise, and thus are inadequate for long-lived decisions such as where to build houses and other structures. So the way the system works now, the subsidized premium rates, passing on the damage and losses to the taxpayers, and these inaccurate flood maps all are perverse incentives leading to more coastal development where it is inappropriate and less focus on resilience. Next slide. this is just economics. If you have something that's inappropriately lower priced, it's going to be overused and people aren't, it's not going to drive the proper behavior. So next slide. Again, this is nothing new. The Union of Concerned Scientists a couple of years ago issued a report on the potential impacts of rethinking flood insurance in a world of climate change, in a world of rising sea level rise. So a lot of these, a lot of the policy and other actions that are proposed by the Union of Concerned Scientists have started to work their way into the system, but not completely and not yet. Next slide. So this is the money. What is the money slide? What is to be done? If you want to improve the current system that we have now to work appropriately, not only to make sure that you have loss protection from the damages, but also to start to drive the appropriate behavior at the individual, community, and policymaker level. These are some of the changes that I think need to be done. And one of them is to actually start including sea level projections in flood maps. Two is to start raising the premiums to reflect the true cost of risk. Three is to discourage development in floodplains. There's no more repetitive losses in high risk areas. There's some houses, for example, in Houston that have been paid for by NFIP 5 times, and they just continue to rebuild it based upon the settlement that they got from NFIP. And I think that's the definition of insanity. Why do you keep trying to do things? It makes no sense. So removing unfair subsidies, there are properties that are grandfathered in certain locations or at certain prices that are well below what the true risk is. And everybody that's a policyholder is paying for those subsidies, and that's not appropriate and won't drive the appropriate behavior. The system should also allow for home buyouts and relocations and not just rebuilding in the site that it was at. You need to communicate the flood risks to the buyers. So in every real estate sale, there should be a disclosure of what the sea level rise, projected sea level rise might be, just like their disclosure of other types of risks to home buyers. You can mandate flood insurance at a broader level, not everybody, but much broader than what it is now. It's only required by lenders for certain flood zones. And you could expand that to expand the risk pool. You could offer incentives for relocations and for upgrades, which is retrofitting, building houses on stilts or relocating away from the flood zone. You could set smart guidelines for rebuilding, making them more climate resilient, similar to what the upgraded building codes were after Iniki. You could raise awareness of the FEMA community rating system, which is a process, an initiative, a program that FEMA has that encourages investments for better flood risk management. And in exchange for that, the entire areas, the entire community gets favorable insurance premium rates. And then the last thing is to have something that that the state and county can do is to update the protective recommendations, like the building codes, like zoning, like bigger coastline setbacks.
So just for context, Coastal Zone Management Program has a really broad mandate, working collaboratively with other agencies to balance economic development as well as environmental policies. But today I'd like to talk a little bit about just one aspect of our program in relation to sea level rise and the topic of managed retreat, particularly the special management area. I know a lot of people in our field are very familiar with this term. Developers are very familiar with this term. Broadly, it's a band of land that's been identified as particularly sensitive, close to the ocean, requires additional mitigation activities occurring within this area. Therefore, it requires an SMA permit, which has been primarily delegated to and administered by the counties through the planning departments and planning commissions or the council. We work with the counties to ensure that their activities are consistent with coastal zone management law. Next slide. So coastal erosion and sea level rise are particularly challenging due to the complexity of land use. There are adjacent jurisdictions among the county, state, and federal regulations. As a simple example, the DLNR has jurisdiction of submerged lands up to the high water mark, and then the county's jurisdiction includes the landward side from there, and activities that occur in the water may affect the water might need Department of Health and Corps permits, just as a start of the activities that are associated with coastal land management. And so some of the recent work that we've done to improve decision-making in this area includes funding research to support updates to UH data to provide information on the coastal erosion rates, historical and projected. That helps to inform the counties, and they use the information to inform setbacks for development to shift to the location of new development further away from the shoreline, as well as reducing risks to people's homes and to their lives as well. Next slide. Some recent studies and plan updates. We've worked with a consultant and explored in about 2017-18 the adaptation strategy of managed retreat and provided an overview level report of case studies. We invited speakers to share their perspectives on managed retreat from industries, including real estate, insurance, and economics. And we took that feedback and information and used it for a theoretical application for different types of development in Hawaii at a high level. Managed retreat trip conversations are difficult. Ultimately, what we're talking about are people's homes and businesses and significant changes in their lives. And so for long-term planning, we certainly would like to do more in the realm of managed retreat to ensure that any future potential land use policy is comprehensive, also including socioeconomic implications, and is suitable for Hawaii. What I mean for that is, for example, one case study and speaker for our symposium from New Jersey, which is often cited as a success. They've done a great job in using housing and urban development funding to conduct buyouts for the purposes of relocating people out of flooded areas, specifically for Superstorm Sandy, which is a big influx of funding for the area. In that example, we asked what the average cost was to purchase and demolish one of those structures. At the time, they told us $300,000. And I believe the median price in Hawaii for a single family home was $750,000. So there's a scale difference that we need to really think about in Hawaii. And as Ed was talking about funding, there's a lot of funding that's needed to conduct these types of activities. The second document that you'll see is the State Ocean Resources Management Plan. It was updated in 2020. It's a statewide plan that focuses on issues that require collaboration to move forward on implementation to protect ocean health and its resources. On the right, those are the three focus areas in the plan. Sea level rise and coastal erosion are the driving forces for the development in coastal hazards area. Excuse me. Right now, we're working on initiating a study, or we'll call it a pilot, Ed, to develop a methodology to identify an appropriate scale for regional shoreline management. Rather than relying on the current practice to address these challenges on a parcel by parcel basis, this often lends to shoreline hardening as a response, with the intent to help protect the structure, but thereby affecting the beaches. The intent for this regional pilot, let's call it, is to help facilitate nearer and midterm adaptation strategies such as beach renourishment and living shorelines. Next slide. There have also been some recent policy changes at the state level that are affecting Office of Planning and enacted to address sea level rise and erosion issues. Act 45 was from the legislative session of 2020. It established the first statewide sustainability program within the newly named Office of Planning and Sustainable Development, which is where the CZM program is housed. It also expanded its roles and responsibilities to serve as the centralized state agency to work on statewide sustainability and climate adaptive planning and coordination, as well as sea level rise adaptation coordination. Act 16 amended the Coastal Zone Management Law to include consideration of sea level rise in planning. It strengthened the protection of beaches by prohibiting seawalls for private property in areas with beaches. It increased the minimum shoreline setback to 40 feet. There are counties that have their setbacks significantly further than 40 feet for the purposes of coastal erosion and sea level rise planning. And then now also includes single family homes into the requirement to obtain an SMA permit. Previously, single family homes were not considered development and therefore did not trigger the need for an SMA permit. Most recently, Act 178 required the Office of Planning and Sustainable Development to coordinate with state agencies that have operating or planned facilities that are subject to sea level rise and other natural hazards. As our first step, we're initially focusing specifically on sea level rise and have been working with the state agencies to gather that data. It's a great first step to understand the exposure of state building assets, but we'll absolutely have to work that information into a broader set of data, including county infrastructure, state roads and bridges, private infrastructure, and even state lands that don't have facilities on them. Next slide. So the next slide is a clip from our ORMP document, the Ocean Resources Management Plan, that includes components that the CZM program is working towards coordinating for implementation. You can see that managed retreat is included, and we're currently doing some revamping of our website to improve how we share the progress for these initiatives on our website at planning.hawaii.gov. In long-term planning for sea level rise, managed retreat, I do see a role for it to be one of the adaptation strategies that we employ, and it does have a role to shape future land use policy. A lot of questions remain about community sentiment regarding their perception of risks in low-lying coastal areas, how to prioritize and identify the areas for managed retreat, where in our fairly landlocked islands might we relocate given our housing stock and our fixed amount of land, and kind of scaling down the suite of land use tools that people are talking about at a national level and the implications that might be employed in Hawaii, such as transfer of development rights, rolling easements, changes in insurance, for example. And then talked briefly about the funding mechanism scaled to the cost of living in Hawaii. We also need to better understand, although we do have a lot of information about the implications of not retreating on organisms and animals that rely on beaches, rocky shorelines, and the nearshore environment as habitat. So that's the balance part of like the people who are using the land, living on the land, as well as the environment that we share with all the other species. And so while those require gathering of data and expertise in the areas, there's some simpler but equally important items that I think we've identified that we could all be doing better in, which includes consistent communication about our risks, broader outreach for audience for education and about coastal hazards risks. I feel like we always talk into this vacuum, so I'm very pleased to be on this panel today. And identify alternatives to traditional hardening where it's feasible. And then we also, as I mentioned, just there are a lot of complications relating to managed retreat, but we need to include it as one of those long-term adaptation strategies.